I think I've read Taylor maybe 100, 150 times, and I'm still finding new stuff in him, which is, of course, exactly what a metaphysical writer would want. That every time you pick up the poem, you find something new there. Okay, we're on then to the next two literary movements, rationalism and romanticism. And rationalism has in common with the neoclassical and the intellectual side of Puritanism that it emphasizes the intellect, and romanticism has in common with the spiritual side of Puritanism and with the metaphysical that it emphasizes the emotional. I do try to set these up in contrasting pairs. Rationalism comes along when you have a world that's basically been torn apart by unanswerable questions. What does God want? How does God want the Bible read? What does he want us to do about it? And people killed one another over those questions for which there can't be any final answer unless we get it directly from God, and yet everybody thought they had one. People got pretty tired of that emotionalism that went with the words of religion, and rationalism offers an alternative. Modern rationalists are generally either agnostics, there may or may not be a God, we have to reserve judgment until all the evidence is in, or atheists. There is no God. It's all existentialism. It's all a meaningless accident. Nobody started it, nobody's running it, and it's not going anywhere. The early rationalists, however, almost universally believed in a supreme being of some sort. Their approach, as it was to everything, was practical. Do we have the section on Franklin's deism, Franklin's idea about religion? He says all religions disagree about innumerable things, but the points on which they agree are the ones that are most likely to be right, since all the religions agree on them. And he made a list of them. There is a God. God is benevolent. Good and evil in this world are punished in the next. The greatest good that you can do is the good you do to your fellow man. So these are tenets that almost everybody can subscribe to. So if there is a true religion, that's probably it. Now, it was given the name deism because it didn't necessarily personify God as a particular being, and it didn't follow any other given theology except the ones that most religions, or what Franklin thought was all religions, held at the time. Their approach is that there is a supreme being, and in fact the early rationalists argued that God is not crazy. God makes sense. Because God makes sense, the world makes sense. And it's in fact man's obligation to understand the world in order to understand God. When we figure out how the world works and everything in it works, we'll understand how God thinks. And in fact, we'll be well on our way to becoming gods ourselves. It's like Einstein said, God doesn't play dice with the universe. There are certain laws, and the physical world operate within those laws. All we have to do is figure out what those laws are. Now, among the tools that we have is not divine revelation. You don't have to wait around for God to give you a vision about these things. You can look at the world and figure it out. And you can do it in two ways. One, you apply reason. Truth can be proven logically. You have to have evidence for it, and it has to make sense. So that if you come and say, well, God told me that he wants everybody to wear sneakers. He wants everybody to wear Adidas. In the past, there was nothing you could say about that except he didn't come and tell me that, or he did come and tell me, but he wants everybody to wear Reeboks. All you people who are wearing Adidas are wrong. You're the enemies of God. Take them off or we'll kill you. That's basically what happened. Now, if somebody comes to you with the rationalists, you can say, well, let's look at this. One, does it stand the test of reason? Is there some reason why God would favor one sneaker company over another? I don't think so. That doesn't seem to make much sense. All right, then let's turn to evidence. Do you have any evidence that God wants this? Did he leave you a golden sneaker of some kind? Did he leave you a piece of paper that won't burn? Did he give you anything? Is there a big footprint in your yard? Is there anything that shows us that God came to you and told you that? No. So you have no evidence, and your vision doesn't make any sense. Now the rationalist doesn't have to say you're wrong, but what he says is you can't get me to believe it until you're going to have these, until you can satisfy these two things, reason and evidence. And that means we put aside all questions on which we cannot gather evidence. Is there a life after death? Nobody knows. Until we can die willingly and stay dead for a long period of time and come back, we won't know if there's a life after death. Because that's the only way we could gather that evidence, is that people repeatedly die and come back and all their stories are the same. But until then, we have to put that question aside. We don't say, no, there isn't one, because we have no evidence there is. We say we have to wait until we get some evidence. And we put that question aside. So people no longer have to kill each other over these ideas. The physical world is the only world we can know anything about with certainty. The spiritual world is always a matter of interpretation, so most of the questions of the spiritual world get put aside. And we focus on the physical world. And again, for the early rationalists, the physical world was the key to understanding the spiritual anyway. You figure out how the world works, you figure out how God's mind works. You already have an understanding of the supernatural. And they thought God's mind was pretty orderly. Otherwise, the world wouldn't have so much of an orderly pattern to it. All knowledge arises from experience, from sensation, sorted and combined with reflection. We're almost all the way back to Aristotle here. The physical world is the real world, the things that you can touch and see and taste and hear, etc. And then you think about the evidence that you gathered. For them, nature was a machine. And the machine that they most frequently compared it to was the clock. It's Isaac Newton's clockwork universe. Generally, people see the world in terms of their most advanced piece of technology. They form those kinds of a knowledge. Well, the clock, the mechanical clock, was really impressive because prior to the mechanical clock, there was no accurate way of telling time. Hourglasses, candles of different sizes, the sundial, all of those had disadvantages. And you couldn't measure stuff at night, you couldn't measure stuff in the rain, and you couldn't tell a minute from 2 minutes or 5 minutes. But when the mechanical clock comes along, you can tell the 360th part of an hour. That's awfully impressive. Newton is one of their intellectual heroes. And Newton's big claim to fame was that he could predict eclipses. He could even predict past eclipses. And that doesn't sound like something you'd want to put on your resume. You can predict eclipses in the past. But it's enormously useful for this reason. If they sort of knew how eclipses occurred, the moon gets in between the sun and the earth, casts its shadow. They knew how that worked. Well, if you can tell when those things are going to line up, it means they line up with some sort of regularity. In other words, the planets move around like the wheels on a clock. And you wind them forward and the planets line up, and you wind them back 500 years and the planets wind up. That's why it's important to be able to predict past eclipses. You want to be able to predict future ones, but they don't come all that often. And they're not always visible where you are. So you might have to wait 200 years to prove whether this theory works or not. But if you say, according to this mathematics, they should have occurred on these dates, and then we go back and look in history, and they did occur on those dates, it means the mechanics are right, and the world is like a big clock. If the world's like a big clock, all we have to figure out is how the gears work, and then we can understand the clockmaker. Every clock is a little bit different. And the mind of the watchmaker is contained in that clock. And if we can understand the clock of the world, we can understand the mind of God. They had a couple other things that made them enormously optimistic. Modern rationalists tend to be pessimistic. Theories like entropy. The universe is flying apart. Eventually all pieces of matter will get so far apart, their heat will be lost into the intervening distance. The temperature will drop down to near absolute zero. Nothing will ever move. End of story. Not much to look forward to. The early rationalists were optimistic, and they were optimistic for a couple reasons. The Puritans and religionists in general had usually said that man is born bad. He's evil, that's why there's so much evil in the world. John Locke comes along, and he made a lot of contributions in a lot of areas, including education as a philosopher. But probably his greatest contribution is the concept of tabula rasa. Tabula rasa means blank slate. And what he says is, the mind is a blank slate at birth. We are not born bad. We're not born good. We're not born bad either. We're born blank. We have no innate tendency towards evil. Well, if human beings are born neutral, how come they behave so badly? They learn it. It comes from their environment. And this is an enormous breakthrough because it opens up the idea that if you can change, if environment makes people good or bad, how do you make better people? Change the environment, make it better. Better environment makes better people. That'll make an even better environment. That'll make even better people, even better environment, even better people. And you have this enormous upward spiral, a spiral of progress. Things are going to get better and better and better. You can see why they were so optimistic. Prior to that, there wasn't much reason to try to reform things. War, disease, theft, murder, all of those things came from God, and they were either to test the faith of the righteous or they were to punish the wicked. It was almost presumptuous for human beings to try to make the world better, because God had apparently put those things in it where he wanted them to be, and who are you to get rid of plagues and pestilences? Secondly, it wouldn't do you any good anyway. Man is naturally bad. If you transform the world into paradise, he would screw up the second paradise just like he did the first. People are naturally bad. If you give him paradise, pretty soon it's going to be filled with litter and graffiti anyway, because that's the way human beings are. They're evil. But Locke says they're neutral. If they're neutral, then all we have to do to make better people is to make a better environment. Not only can we change people, but they had a tool for making a better environment, and that tool was the scientific method. Even the classical period had the first three steps. Observe the world, collect your evidence, draw a conclusion. The problem was they could never tell whether their conclusions were accurate or not because they never took the next step. Anybody know what the next step in the scientific method is? After you've formed a hypothesis. A generalization. You test it. You test it. You conduct an experiment to see if it was right. You take the evidence from that test and you revise your hypothesis. You make your hypothesis better. Your generalization. Do you stop there? No. You test your new hypothesis. You get new information, new hypothesis, new test. New hypothesis, new test, new information. New hypothesis, new test, new information. And it always gets more and more and more and more accurate. The world is going to get better and better. Our knowledge always gets more and more and more refined. This is what makes rationalism, which leads to science, it goes hand in hand with science and the Industrial Revolution. This is what allows rationalism to put religion out of business. Okay, it's not gone entirely, but it certainly doesn't dominate the world like it did for the Puritans. Most people claim to have a religious belief, but most people do not live their entire lives focused on that the way the Puritans and people in their time did. And when we look for a source of authority, if you want to prove something to somebody, do you haul out your sacred book? How do you prove that you're right to win an argument? Generally, you go to science. Experiments have shown, here's the data that proves this. Science is now the final arbiter. And rationalism had this advantage. Because of the scientific method, it didn't have to be infallible. Here's the difficulty with religion. When you make a pronouncement and you say this is what God wants or this is what God believes, you cannot be wrong. You can't come back tomorrow and say, remember what I told you yesterday? Forget that. It's just the opposite of that. Why not? If I'm telling you what God says and I'm wrong today, it means I could be wrong about every time I tell you something that God says. If I'm wrong once, I could be wrong more than once. So if you're going to be a religion and you're going to say this is what God believes or wants or says, you have to stick with that. No matter how obviously it is you're wrong, because as soon as you say, oops, we were wrong about that, you lose all your credibility. But a scientist can come in and tell you something today. It's good for you to stand on your head. You ought to do it about 8 hours a day. And I can come back next week and tell you, 8 hours is not good. 10 minutes maybe, that's about the max. And I can even come back the third week and tell you standing on your head is no good for you at all. And I won't lose any credibility. Why not? We had new evidence. First time I told you it was good to stand on your head for 8 hours, nobody had done it much. By the second week, we'd had a lot of people stand on their heads for 8 hours. They all ended up with flat heads and headaches and high blood pressure. So we decided to cut it back. And after the third week, we found out that even 10 minutes isn't that good for you. New evidence. So science can contradict itself all the time as long as new evidence has come along in the meantime. It doesn't have to be infallible, and that's an advantage that religion just really couldn't overcome. Now the great thing about the scientific method is it gives you a way to solve those problems of the environment which create people. Basically, the rationalists looked at the world and said, most problems are really one problem. Disease, war, poverty, crime are all really this problem. There isn't enough stuff to go around. So people steal it from each other. People don't have enough, so they get sick. Countries make war on each other to steal their stuff. There's two solutions. Here's the problem. 2x amount of people, 1x amount of goods. Two ways to make it come out even. What are they? Half the people are double the goods. Now the Romantics, so you see, look at everything in moral terms, would have said, what a horrible thought, kill half the people? The Rationalists say, hey, we didn't say we're going to do that, we're looking at all the options. As a matter of fact, that isn't really a viable option. It isn't practical. The world is not going to line up like gym class, count off by twos, and the twos are going to step out and let the ones murder them. That's not going to happen. So the only practical solution is double the amount of goods. So the great hero for the rationalist is the entrepreneur. Why does Franklin spend so much time telling you about how his businesses were successful? Because that's what he wants you to do. Successful business profits society. If I set up a factory to make shoes, everybody ends up with shoes. I benefited society. Did I make some money in the process? Absolutely. Am I entitled to? Absolutely. The rationalists believe in enlightened self-interest. First, they believe in self-interest. In other words, the first question anybody asks is, what's in it for me? If I come to you and say, it breaks my heart there are so many barefoot people. I'm going to make a factory to make shoes for them. Will you give me some money for it? How many of you would give me the money? If I say to you, there are a lot of barefoot people around here. I think we got a real market for shoes. I want to set up a shoe factory. I'm going to employ people in it. They'll be able to buy shoes. They'll buy bread and stuff with the wages I pay them. So the baker and the butcher will be able to buy shoes. They'll buy clothes to go with their shoes, so the clothes makers will be able to buy shoes also. I see an upward spiral here of shoe consumption, shoe production. Would you invest in? And if I said to you, I expect about a 30% return on my investment, you definitely want to get in. That's the rationalist. Why would I go and make shoes for anybody unless I'm getting something out of it? And if getting 30% makes me make more shoes, then I'm a hero. Because a whole lot of people would have been barefoot, or would have been able to afford shoes because of my employing people, now are able to. So I've benefited society. Franklin's personal successes in business almost all make a better world. Just the way almost all of his seemingly philanthropic contributions make a better world. But we'll look at those after the break. So for the rationalist, the entrepreneur is the great hero, because the essential problem is there isn't enough stuff to go around. The entrepreneur makes more stuff, and more stuff solves all those problems. As soon as there's enough stuff for everybody, crime stops, disease goes down, war comes to an end. And so they work towards that end. That's why they're also why they're so practical. Where the neoclassics had looked to Greece and Rome for their authority, the rationalist looks to the form of experts, people who have some experience with whatever it is that they're talking about. The neoclassicist wants to find directions on which train goes to Long Island. In Grand Central Station, they look around for somebody with a Phi Beta Kappa pin. And ask him in Greek and ask him in Latin how to get to Long Island. But the rationalist goes to the information booth. And if he can't find that, he looks for a conductor. If he can't find a conductor, he looks for a janitor, because at least he knows when he has to sweep up on certain platforms. That'll give him a way to figure out which train it is that goes and when it goes. Very legalistic, like the Puritans. But now their government, also like the Puritans, is based on the individual. You have to have a basis for the government. The rationalist says you can't have divine right of kings. The reason you can't have divine right of kings is because nobody knows who God wants to be king. We don't get any direct messages from God, so we can't really say. Therefore, there has to be some other basis. And the basis that they constructed was that each of us gives up some of their rights in return to the king, in return for good government. It's a contract. And if the king doesn't produce good government, what do? You withdraw your support. You take back the rights that you had given him. In fact, if he hasn't provided good government, he's already broken the contract. So government's based on a contract. The just consent of the governed. And you notice how politics is very important to the rationalists, because politics is how things get done. Franklin spends a lot of time talking about politics. They're unashamedly materialistic, because, again, the entrepreneur gets rich by enriching the world, and that's a good thing. Franklin is very proud of his material successes. They're pragmatic. In other words, they ask, does it work? And they're practical, meaning that they want some tangible end to everything they look at. So that even when they look at philosophy, their philosophy always roots itself in, how is this going to work? They're willing to compromise on the methods, although not necessarily the goals. They don't believe in perfection. These are practically the people who invent the compromise. The rationalist says, look, you don't get perfection in this world. Even if you did, it wouldn't last very long. You have a great job or you have a great team, how long does that last? It immediately begins to deteriorate. Therefore, you got to figure that we're never going to have perfection. Perfection is what we strive towards. When we look at the Romantics, you'll see that the Romantic wants perfection. Jonathan Edwards prays 6 times a day, examines his conscience continually, and is appalled at himself because he sometimes has wayward thoughts. Ben Franklin's life would have embarrassed Bill Clinton most of the time. And Franklin is not ashamed himself in the least. He says, I'm a little bit better person than I was the day before yesterday. I'm doing great. And he's perfectly happy with himself. They don't expect perfection. Ideally, the rationalist wants everybody to come out ahead on a deal. Why? We make a deal, 95% of it runs in my favor and 5% runs in yours. You going to live up to your end? The rationalist doesn't expect you to, because your question is going to be, what's in it for me? 5% is in it for me. That's not enough. I want a better deal. But if everybody feels like they got enough, then everybody's going to make it work. So the rationalists, it sounds kind of idealistic that the rationalists want everybody to win. But they do. They don't want everybody to get everything they wanted. They don't expect perfection. But they want everybody to get enough that they'll be satisfied with it. Because that way they'll support whatever agreement it was that they came to. And they're not trying to beat you this time because they want to do business with you in the future. And if they may beat you out of this one time, but you're not coming back. And they're always looking for the long term. Ultimately, the end justifies the means, although it's quite a while before somebody finally says that. And I can't never remember whether it's Karl Marx or it's Nietzsche. But the rationalists believed it without actually articulating it. That how you got, then you can see it all the time, of course, in Franklin. He keeps getting social changes made which are for people's benefits, but he does sometimes some shady things in the way. For example, Constitutional Convention. Franklin's getting kind of on in years by then, and he comes in and he sits down and he seems to nod off. And even his enemies were saying, well, you know, it's really sad. I mean, Franklin and I have been the opposite sides of the question almost all of our lives, but you just hate to see an intellect like that deteriorate. So the poor guy can't even stay awake. Then they would plan what they were going to propose. When it would start, before they could make their proposals, Franklin would stand up and make a modified form of their proposal with all the mistakes corrected. After a while, somebody, and he did this more than once, so people are going to say either Ben's part of the Psychic Friends Network or something else is going on here. What they found was it's a dome ceiling. And dome ceilings make sound bounce in odd ways, so that when people whispered on that side of the room, where Ben was sitting was where it was focused. He could hear them like they were talking out loud. He wasn't sleeping, he was just being quiet, listening to what they had to say. Did he feel guilty about that? No. He said, look, if I eavesdropped on some politicians, yeah, that makes me feel real bad. If I hadn't eavesdropped, they would have made their proposals. Their proposals were not bad, but they had flaws. Once they made them, they were going to have to defend them, because that's the way people are. They make a suggestion, they don't want to change it. They don't want to admit they're wrong in any way. So by seeing where their mistakes were, I got to stand up ahead of them, change the mistakes, put forward their ideas. If what they really wanted was to get something good done and not just to get credit, then they got what they wanted. A good thing got done, an even better thing than they would have done. Because if I'd have let them get up and propose it, I would have had to make fools out of them to show all the errors in it. And that would have alienated them, and they wouldn't have voted for my changes, and the people wouldn't have ended up with good laws. Or we wouldn't have ended up with a constitution that works the way that it does. So everybody profited. Did I have to do something bad to do that? Like eavesdrop? Yes. Those ends do justify the means. Franklin's almost, I can't even think of a time when Franklin is guilty, feels guilty about anything. When it comes to their art, first of all, they said it ought to inform. It ought to instruct. The greatest artist is the one who can dispense the most useful information to the widest number of people. That's why they wrote in what's called plain style. Plain style is pretty much what its name implies. If you want to have a lot of people get this information, first of all, you're going to have simple diction. Your word choice is not going to be the most elaborate you can concoct. You're not going to show off your learning. You're not going to quote from any Greeks or Romans, and you're certainly not going to quote in Greek because nobody can read it. Instead, you're going to find the simplest words that you can to express your ideas. No ornamentation. Again, no quotes from the Greeks and the Romans. No little long-winded stories explaining your point. No elaborate phrasing. Simple diction, a simple syntax as well. A simple order of ideas. Minimum of descriptive adjectives. Like the neoclassicists, the rationalists believed in the intellect. And you know what happens. Emotion goes up, what happens to the intellect? It goes down. Well, when you increase sensation, you increase emotion. So that you want to pick out only the necessary descriptive adjectives. Press the red button, not depress the pulsating scarlet orb. The latter may stir up your sensations, but that's exactly the opposite of what the rationalist wants to do. He wants to play down your sensations. Logical arrangement of ideas. People can follow things if you go in a reasonable order. So generally you give the evidence, and then you draw the conclusion. Or you give the evidence and you lead them towards the conclusion and let them draw it for themselves, which is an even more effective technique. Frequent use of example. People understand abstract ideas by putting them in concrete terms. The more examples you can give, the more likely people are to understand what it is you're saying. If you're writing persuasive prose, where you're trying to get people to do something for a reason, the more reasons you can give them, and the more concrete examples of how those things would work in their life, the more likely they are to be persuaded. Finally, objective tone. Even when Franklin writes the autobiography in the first person, and yet it's objective, it's aloof, it never gets emotional. Probably the most emotional incident in there is done totally without emotion. We notice Franklin tells us about his successes. He tells us how he accomplished them, but he never tells us how he felt. He never tells us how good he felt at being named Postmaster General. He may mention that he got an award, but he'll never tell you that he sat up looking at it for 3 days and how good it made him feel. He never gets into his feelings. Even in that one instance where he says he had a son and he didn't get him vaccinated because he thought the vaccine was dangerous, and his son died. And he brings that up to get people who haven't had their children vaccinated to vaccinate them. But he doesn't tell you how it felt to lose that child. Franklin, who was basically a happy person, he really enjoyed life. But for at least a year after that, was absolutely devastated by the loss of that child. And even 10, 15 years later, still had these reveries where he would think about him. I think the boy was like 5 years old or something when he died. So it had an enormous emotional impact on him. And yet you see nothing about that impact at all. Because he's doing the pragmatic thing. He's trying to tell you what to do, and he gives you useful reasons, and he gives you specific examples, and it happens to come from his own life. But he doesn't let you inside himself, because that's not what the rationalist wants to do. The rationalist doesn't like emotions. The emotions may cloud your judgment. He doesn't want you getting your kid vaccinated because you feel bad about his son dying. He wants you not to make that mistake, because it's more dangerous in the long run not to vaccinate them than it is the dangers they'll have from the vaccine. In other words, he wants you to make a rational decision. He doesn't even want to influence you with his own emotion. And also, emotion has no place in a rational argument. Emotion clouds the judgment. You want to give people evidence. You want to give them evidence in a way that they can understand it. Use simple words, simple phrasing, lots of examples, reasonable, logical arrangement of ideas, and let them draw the conclusion from it. Now, the Romantics are just the opposite of the Rationalists. And you notice that they come in after the Rationalists have pretty much had their way for about a century. And when Rationalism comes in and really starts to gain ground, it looks like they're right. Everything does get better. Put aside the old arguments over religion and the supernatural and focus on the physical world. Try to apply enlightened self-interest. Sometimes what enlightened self-interest means is that sometimes you'll put aside your immediate interest in terms of long-term goals. For example, you notice that Franklin is pretty rich, and yet he wants to see the regular working man profit as well. Why? Why would he like to see everybody be a homeowner? When the revolution starts, how many homeowners run out and join up? None. You've been paying 15 years on your mortgage. A sudden 180-degree change in the way the world is running does not look like a good thing to you. You have something invested in the society as it is. That's why he wanted wages to be better. That's why he wanted working men to have a lending library where they could go and improve their minds. Because the more money they made, the more they invested in property and things which would keep them from having a revolution. Jefferson says we need a revolution every 20 years. And unfortunately, nobody listened to him. But Ben Franklin and the Rationalists would never have said that. They didn't like Franklin is not in favor of the American Revolution. He only joins it after he sees that it's inevitable. He wanted a reconciliation. He spent a lot of time in England. He spent a lot of time in France trying to get that. When he realized it wasn't going to happen, then he said, if we do not all hang together, we will all hang separately. He knew that if they had a revolution without him, he was still going to get blamed. And if the British won and hung everybody behind the revolution, Ben Franklin was going to get hung. So he had to get involved to make sure it worked. Because if it didn't work, he was going to have to pay the dues on it anyway. Self-interest was behind a lot of everything that he did, and he didn't think that was a bad thing. Self-interest is behind what everybody does. Again, it's why he has that enormous interest in politics. Now, after rationalism has been around for a while, and things seem to be going better, and the standard of living has gone up, the side effects become noticeable. You can't see the sun in London at 12 o'clock in the afternoon because of the smoke from all the manufacturers. The factories are being built in the cities because they're close to the supply lines. Well, there aren't railroads then, but the river boats and the ports. Well, the problem with having the factories in the city is everybody moves there. But the city isn't made to hold that many people. So you have people all packed in together, and suddenly you have epidemic diseases, which you didn't have before. People are making more money, but they're living in the city, and they're getting their fruit and vegetables 2 and 3 days after they normally got them. Their water isn't pure. They have a well that's being used by 6,000 people instead of maybe 60 or 150. The air isn't pure. All of these side effects. And work is becoming meaningless. You go to work at a place where you make part of some sort of an object. Well, you no longer have really much pride in what it is you produce. Your life starts to become meaningless. And Romanticism springs up as a reaction to the problems caused by the Industrial Revolution and by rationalism. Rationalism says there's a bottom line. You can add things up and decide whether a thing is good or bad. The Romantics say everybody is one of a kind. There's never been another you. There will never be another you. You are beyond price. If you die, no matter how much money we have, we cannot replace you. Therefore, everybody is unique. Everybody is an individual. You can't add up individuals. No two of us are alike. You can't add up unlike things. So you can't say, this highway benefited 100,000 commuters, and we only had to take the homes away from 500 people to put it up. 100,000 people made this happy. That's a lot of happy. 5,000 people made this miserable. Not anywhere near as much misery as we created good, so therefore it was a good thing. There's a bottom line. The Romantic says you never should have taken anybody's house away. When you even think about that, it makes you feel bad. You should have found some other way. You can't add people up. Everybody's unique and individual. Everybody's one of a kind, and everybody's priceless. Personal insight and mystical revelation are more accurate than reason. You can see why the rationalists hated the Romantics. It looks like you're going back to the days of people believing stuff because that was what they felt. Divine revelation is a measure for truth. That's scary to them. It threatens to undo everything they did. What the Romantics said is this. Everybody's one of a kind. Everybody is one of a variation of the good. You're a unique form of the good. There's never been a form of the good like you before, so you have to live out your form of the good. Everybody is here to do what's right. Sounds hard, but the Romantic says it's really very easy for this reason. Everybody has a built-in moral compass, and it always points true north. And that moral compass is your heart. It's this simple. Good feels good, and evil feels bad. When you think of doing something bad, it makes you feel bad. When you do something good, you don't need any thank yous. You don't need anybody to tell you did something good. It feels good when you do it. All you have to do then is follow your heart. Your heart will tell you. You don't even have to do the thing. You just have to think about it. We're going to shoot the puppy. Is that all right with everybody? No, not all right with me either. As soon as you think about that thing, it makes you feel bad. So what does that tell you? It's a bad thing, no matter what you're getting out of it. So if you're one of those scientists who shoots dogs to find out what the wounds are like, on the theory that that's going to help you fix wounds in human beings 10 years from now, the romantic says you're doing the wrong thing. When you think of that very act, it makes you feel bad. It must be wrong. All we have to do is follow our heart. And here's the problem. Wait a second. When John Locke said everybody's born neutral, the great hero of the Romantics was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau said everybody's born good. Everybody's born good with a compass to keep them on the road to good. Well, how do we end up doing so much awful stuff? We stop being able to see the compass. The compass is your feelings. We stop being able to feel. Well, how do we stop being able to feel? What drives down emotion? The intellect. The intellect is how we stop being able to feel. Our whole school system, rationalism itself, a good portion of our society tells us not to feel. In fact, you could say that our educational system is basically a process of numbing ourselves to our emotions and to our sensations. They will not let you go on to first grade unless you can sit still and not look out the window and not laugh, not cry, not get up and walk around. Doesn't matter how bright you are, until you've learned to deny those basic things. What the Romantic says is your real key to what's right about the world. You can't go on. And the more you get involved with education and civilization, the more it tells you to use your intellect. And the more you use your intellect, the more you drive down your emotions. The more you drive down your emotions, the less you can feel. One of the artistic problems that the Romantics addressed was the inability of people to feel. That's why they wrote things like horror stories. To put people into an intense emotional state. An emotional state so intense that it would block out their reason. Because reason is what keeps you from feeling the truth. The intellect is the enemy as far as the Romantic is concerned. You have to get back to following your heart. And if you follow your heart, everything's going to turn out fine. The Rationalists, of course, think that's all preposterous nonsense. They believe, again, in enlightened self-interest. The Romantic believes in idealism, altruism. You do something because it feels good to do it, not because you're going to make a buck out of it in some way, not because you're going to get anything in return, but just because it feels good to do something for somebody else. If you follow your heart, everything turns out all right. The world is not a machine, and the significance of the world is not how it works. The Romantic looks at a rainbow and sees just what the Puritans saw, a message about the divine. The rainbow doesn't quite touch the ground. You've got to make the leap of faith to get there. The rainbow is beauty. Beauty is what connects the supernatural and the natural world. The Rationalist looks at a rainbow and says, red, yellow, orange, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Where have we seen that before? Prisms. Newton put white light through a prism, that's the way it comes out. Something up there is acting as a prism. What could it be? Water droplets. That's what it is. Water droplets are breaking up the light. So if we spray water droplets at a certain angle, we should get just what you get, rainbows. Now we can make those things. We'll charge the Romantics for admission because they're only going to squander their money giving it away anyway. We can make a buck out of this. Ultimately, the Rationalist wants to make some material gain out of things. The Romantics instead see some symbolic message about the world. The world is a poem. It's not a machine. And what it's about good. Nature is a metaphor. Everything is metaphoric. You can see how the Romantics have some things in common with the with the Puritans. They see basically a world about good and evil. They see it in symbolic terms. Everything stands for something else. Things are messages. You're supposed to do what's right. You have to follow your conscience. You have to follow your heart. Romantics probably the Romantics and the Puritans don't really begin to part company until it gets to love and passion. The Puritans were all about denial of your passions. The Romantics are all about giving way to them. If it feels good, do it. The cult of sensibility that sprung up about Rousseau was one of the things that gave Romanticism a bad name. It's because it was filled with so many phonies. Here's the thing. The most sensitive people, now when they say sensibility, we would say sensitivity. The most sensitive people are the best people because it's your feelings that tell you good from bad. The more sensitive you are, the more finely attuned your feelings are, the more nuances of good and bad you could tell apart. So the best people are people who feel the most. Well, the problem with that is that it's easy to fake an emotion. It's easy to fake an emotional response. Whole relationships are built on that idea. It's not easy to fake an intellectual response. I start telling you how much I know about nuclear physics. And eventually I start telling you that the electron is about the size of a basketball. You know I don't know what I'm talking about. But if I start to cry, you don't know whether I really feel anything or I don't. I may have trained myself to be able to do that. There's no way to judge an emotional response. And if I outwardly, all you get is the outward show of an emotional response, you never know for sure what's inside. So in other words, a lot of people pretended emotional responses that they really didn't have because they wanted to be thought well of. They wanted everybody to think they were a good person. And so what you had was a lot of people pretending to be emotional about things they really weren't. A romantic finds a dead bird. What do? They cry. Oh, this isn't just a dead bird. This is a daddy bird. And a mommy bird and baby bird somewhere are waiting for it to come back, and it'll never return. Just as the people we love sometimes disappear from our lives and never return. And this is so sad, and they start to cry. What does a rationalist do? Buries it. This thing spreads disease. Or wait a minute, it's just recently dead. Let's pluck it, cook it, feed it to the poor. Use one problem to solve another. The rationalists are always looking for practical ends for what they do. They would grab the romantic and smack them a few times. Your crying isn't doing any good. This is counterproductive. Pick the bird up and bury it. I'll tell you where. No, not there. It'll get into the water supply. I want it over here. They'll have it all planned out. They think about things. Romantics, it has to be an emotional response. And of course, when you see a dead bird, if you can find something that actually moves you emotionally, all you have to do is think about that. And every once in a while, they interview some actress, and they say, well, how did you get all that emotion in that scene? And they say, well, I thought about this from when I was 11, and that always makes me cry, so I can cry whenever I want now. And the romantics are the same. You can't tell when they're faking. And of course, the rationalists, who didn't feel anything at their worst, believed that nobody felt anything. There were the 19th century romantics in particular, opened themselves up to sensation. They did cry easily, and far from all of their emotional responses were fake. The problem was there were some people who were pretending to be more moved than they were, and maybe a lot of people. But all of them were more open to emotions and let themselves feel more than we let ourselves feel. The romantics, if they had seen a movie, wouldn't feel at all bad about crying about it. The rationalists would say, it's only a movie. It's not real life. Lessons were to be learned here. What practical good can we make out of this? Even when it comes to morality, they differ. The romantic says you've got to follow your heart. Good feels good. The rationalist says morality is a matter of what works. So that a rationalist says we have to have laws against killing people. Not because God doesn't want you to kill anybody. We don't know whether God wants you to kill anybody or not. He certainly puts an awful lot of objectionable people in the world who look like they ought to be killed for somebody who doesn't want them dead, but we don't know what God wants. What we do know is that a society that hasn't got any rules about killing people will fall apart. Why? How many of you got a list of people you'd like to kill if they ever make it legal someday? So like what, I'm the only psychotic in here? I mean, I pass people on the parkway every day I think too dumb to live. If I ever get to be emperor, the population's going down awfully rapidly. But you can't have people kill people just because they annoy them. Somebody takes out their cell phone in the movie, you can't shoot them, no matter how much you'd like to. And the romantic says, and the rationalist says, of course you can't. You can't because in a society where anybody can kill anybody else, nobody is safe. Everybody would be afraid to come out of their house. It would all fall apart. You have to have rules against theft. Why? Because God doesn't like stealing? No, we don't know what God thinks. In a society where theft is not punished, who would work? We'd all wait at the pay window, and when the workers got their money, we would beat them up and rob them. A couple hours a week, high profits, not a lot of heavy lifting. Sounds like a good job to me. But we have to have those rules. If we don't have them, society will fall apart. In other words, the rationalist says it won't work without it. That's why this is moral. Morality is just what works in a society. The romantic says, no, there's absolute good and there's absolute bad, and you can feel the difference between the two. It's your job to do what's good. You can't reduce things to numbers. The individual is the ultimate authority. When we get to transcendentalism, you'll see that transcendentalists are a form of romanticism. They're the American philosophic romantics. And they'll say you're the ultimate authority on what's right and wrong because you've got the built-in compass and you have to follow it. Humanity must be free from all systems because systems limit who you are. You are unique. You are one of a kind. You have to live like that. Society will keep you from doing that. The rationalist says if we don't have rules that everybody has to follow, if some people can decide to go north on the left-hand side of the parkway, there's going to be chaos and destruction. The romantic says, no, actually you could drive north in the southbound lane of the parkway because if you followed your heart, you would never get into an accident. You would just weave in and out of the cars, and you would never hit anybody, and you wouldn't even cause any accidents. Everybody would see that you were so at one with things that you weren't going to run into them, and they wouldn't panic and dive out of the way off into the ditches and culverts. The rationalist says we've got to have rules. Everybody's got to follow them. The romantic says we don't need any rules except one: follow your heart. Everybody follows their heart. Everybody does the right thing. You don't need the law. You don't need government. You don't need police of any kind. Everybody does what's right. The rationalist says that isn't the way people really work. The rationalist would say, do you think that's true? Let's find an experiment. We'll take 100 romantics with enough goods to last for a year, and we'll put all the romantics on an island. If we come back and they're sharing and they're living happily with one another, we'll get a bigger island, see if it works more. If it works there, we'll get a bigger island. And pretty soon, maybe they are right, and we'll make the whole society run that way. Of course, if we go back and all there is 4 romantics left eating the bones of the other 96, then we'll know the rationalists are really right, and you can't put civilization back together once you stop it. That's why they don't like revolutionary change, even though rationalists basically planned the American Revolution. But they don't like things turned around 180 degrees because we don't know for sure if the new thing is going to be better than the old thing. The old thing was bad, but even bad isn't absolutely bad. There were still some good things about it. We want to preserve those and add some new good things. So they believe in evolutionary change. The romantic says you got to follow your heart. If it's wrong now, it has to be changed now. If it's completely wrong, it's got to be changed completely. Conscience is the only law. They're self-consciously spiritual. A romantic, well, the noble savage, which was Rousseau's concept. Noble savage is natural man. Man uncorrupted by society. Melville made a great deal of money with his noble savage. Anybody know who his noble savages were? The Polynesians. And his villains are the Christian missionaries who bring them reason and guilt. Fenimore Cooper. Made a lot of money out of the noble savage. But where's noble savages? Last of the Mohicans? Ring any bells? It's a movie. The American Indians, and there are two kinds of Indians, good Indians and bad Indians. Good Indians are natural. Bad Indians have been talking with the French. The French were considered the most intellectual people then. So the French were the ones who taught them to think and not to feel, and that corrupted them. And his hero is Natty Bumppo, a white European raised by Native Americans. He can't read. He follows his heart. He has all these what seem to be supernatural powers, like being able to shoot the heart out of an ace of spades at 100 yards. Mark Twain points out that's about the size of a fly. You can't see a fly at 100 yards. How could he have done that? Cooper would have said because he didn't strain his eyes with reading, because he was naturally good. He didn't even have to aim. His very goodness made him at one with things, and that made him the perfect shot. So you have these noble savages. Now you're going to see a noble savage when you look at the fireside poets as well. The most common form of a noble savage. We come into this world natural. We get corrupted by this world. So who's the most noble? What's a noble savage you see every day? Children. They follow their hearts. They live in their emotions. You can make them cry one minute. You can make them laugh the next. They're naturally good. If you hurt one of them, the rest of them cry. When you give them stuff, they share. Now, the rationalists believe that the Romantics had never actually seen a live child, and that was why they had so many misconceptions about it. They said children are nasty, vicious little beasts, and they have to be given very strict rules, and they have to be basically beaten on until they learn to follow those rules. They have to become civilized. They are savages, and we have to civilize them. The Romantic says, no, children follow their hearts. And if we followed our hearts, we would be like children. We would take care of one another. The problem isn't that there isn't enough to go around. The problem is that greedy people who have lost touch with their feelings are holding on to too much of it. What should you do with what you have? What did they tell you in kindergarten you should do with it? Share it. If everybody shared what they had, there'd be plenty to go around, according to the Romantics. All we have to do is share. So that problem of the practical problem for the rationalists or the Romantics isn't really a problem at all. But in order to get people to share, you have to get them to feel. To get them to feel, you've got to put them back in touch with their feelings, which their intellects have made them lose touch with. They're self-consciously spiritual because if a Romantic starts to get rich, what does it say about them? That they're not sharing fast enough. More is coming in than it's going out, so it means you're hanging on to it. You should be spreading it around. So they start to get rich, they feel uncomfortable about it. They want to be spiritual. Material is the opposite of spiritual. So the more material stuff they have, the less spiritual they feel. The rationalists, on the other hand, think that if you spread around enough material goods, people will feel a lot better and they'll become better people. In other words, they're really trying to go to the same place, just in two absolutely different ways. The Romantics are idealistic. They deal in perfections. They believe that you can have perfection in this world, and they're really not satisfied with less. They always go for that perfect. They always go towards. They go to arrive at that perfection. If they do less than arrive at it, that makes them unhappy. The rationalist says perfection is a goal that you'll never actually reach. Yeah, we should work towards it, but we shouldn't seriously expect to get there. If we get closer to perfection than we are now, we've come out ahead. We've improved. That's all you can really hope for, is to improve. The Romantic says, no, we can be perfect because we are perfect. We just have to follow our hearts. They're uncompromising because you can't compromise with evil. You have to do what's right. And they're passionately committed. They're emotional about what they do. When it comes to their art, they don't write in plain style, although they did often try to write in simple, ordinary language. Because simple language is closest to natural speech. And they try to make their poetry natural speech, because natural is good, artificial is bad. That's the Romantic dichotomy. Because here's the problem. You write a poem. Most of the time, your first draft is not as good as subsequent drafts. But it should be better. because the first draft is the natural one. The other one is artificial because you worked on it. Problem is, and that's why they wrote so much really awful poetry, is they often wrote about phony emotions they didn't have, using language that they didn't mean, and language which got worn out very quickly. Their idea is to teach and inspire, particularly to teach moral values. Because the ultimate question for the Romantic is good and bad, right and wrong. That's what we really need to teach people about, not how to make things. They tend to write more poetry. The Rationalists didn't write very much poetry at all. Wheatley is probably the only rationalist poet I can remember coming across. Because poetry isn't the simplest and easiest way to get an idea across. You don't find a great many poems about how to set the timer on your VCR, because it's just not a good way to get it across. But if you want to stir up the emotions, poetry is a good method to do it with. So the Romantics tend to write poetry, the Rationalists tend to write essays and how-to articles. When they write their poetry, they want common speech, but they want a supernatural intent. In other words, what you say, as plainly as you can, should illuminate the truth behind physical reality. Back to idealism again in Plato. They use what were called emotional touchstones, or romantic touchstones. And a romantic touchstone is an idea, or an object, or a thing, or an event that conjures up an emotional response. So that if I brought a baby in here, even the Rationalists will be talking baby talk to it after a while. But if I brought in 100 babies, one after the other, only the most dyed-in-the-wool Romantic would still be going, ooh, a baby. Most people will be going, another baby? Where are they coming from? And the Rationalists will be saying, no, I think there's an opportunity for daycare here. We could make a buck out of this. If you can't respond to the 100th baby, then the Rationalists argue you can't respond to the 100th mention of a baby. Poem after poem after poem used the phrase innocent babe. And every time you came across that, you were supposed to feel this upwelling of feeling about the uncorrupted nature of man. Well, maybe the first time you see the word innocent babe, you do have that response, but certainly not the 50th, and definitely not the 150th. The problem with emotional touchstones, and there are all kinds of poems entitled Youth, because youth conjures up an emotional response. If you're still in it, you realize it's largely a nightmare. If you're not still in it, you only remember the good part about it. So you feel happy about it. But also, it's gone, so you feel bad. The Romantics loved emotion, raw emotion, any kind. And I really think that they probably liked a good cry almost as much as they liked a good laugh. Maybe even more. If you can get somebody into such an emotional state, when you're going to conjure up emotional states? What's the easiest emotional state to conjure up in people? Fear. You can make everybody afraid. In fact, when you make them afraid, what happens to their intellect? It vanishes. Remember, that's why people in the horror movies go down the cellar when they see the bloody handprint on the door. Any rationalist going, that's a human handprint, that's actual blood, I'm leaving and getting professionals who are experts at dealing with this. But if you're emotional, you're so terrified you can't think, so you do the dumbest thing possible, go down into the dark cellar and see if the killer is still down there. And of course then you find him and the axe. So if you want to put people in an emotional state, you terrify them. That's why they wrote so much scary stuff, so many horror stories, so many ghost stories. Probably the second easiest emotion to conjure up is probably anger. Anger is not a very positive emotion. So what the Romantic would try to do would be to make you angry about injustice. It's okay to be angry about that. And I suppose the third is probably sadness. So you can make people cry. It's a lot easier to make people cry than to make them laugh. In fact, we're going to have the midterm next week instead. Yeah, your first response wasn't to laugh, though. You were only laughing because you thought I was kidding. If you thought I was serious, you'd all had tears in your eyes. It's easier to make people sad generally than it is to make them happy. So they write sad poems. And sorrow is usually much deeper. You laugh for a little while, and then you stop laughing. But when you feel sad, it takes hours to get out of that. You can make people stop laughing pretty quick. It's hard to cheer them up once they're feeling down. So those are intense emotions. That's probably another reason why those are the emotions that the Romantics went for. And they went for them because when you get people into an intense emotional state, their intellect gets wiped out, they're back in touch with their feelings, and their feelings is what makes them tell good from bad. Now, when we look at Franklin, what does Franklin look like to you? A rationalist or a romantic? A rationalist. Everything about his autobiography, which is the story of his life, is really not about Franklin. It's about how Franklin did stuff, how Franklin did useful things. He says, I wrote this thing so that my posterity will know where they came from. That was one reason. He said, I'm not going to tell you I didn't do this for self-aggrandizement. I didn't do this to show off because nobody would believe me. Everybody knows I'm a pretty vain guy, so okay, I wrote it to show off as well. But I mainly wrote it so that people could see how I did things. They could avoid my mistakes, and they could improve on my method. If everybody has to solve the problem starting from scratch, society never moves ahead. But the reason we do move ahead so much is that we build on the successes of the past. We see where people in the past failed, we see where they succeeded, we see ways of improving on their successes. Franklin is always applying the scientific method, and there's no better example of that than the street sweeping incident. He decides, now this is basically Franklin's method, and you know that Franklin has a method for everything he does. Only Franklin would have a method for achieving moral perfection. And in fact, Franklin's method works. You take that thing where you list the virtues. If Franklin were alive today, he would be a billionaire in the self-help industry. Because Franklin's method is the basis of every 12-step or 9-step or 27-step program there is. There would be Franklin rehab centers everywhere in the world. And Franklin would help you rehab from anything. It wouldn't have to be drugs or alcohol. It would be anything, because if you use Franklin's method, it works. You write down what you think a good person is, what those characteristics are. You take them one at a time. Why do you take them one at a time? Why don't you try to improve all your faults? Well, maybe you only have a few faults. I have so many. Franklin had so many. He knew that would make you too scattered. You'd fail too often. You notice when he lists his faults, he lists the characteristics he wants to achieve. What does he put last? Chastity and humility. It was on the quiz. Humility, he said, look, I'm a vain guy. If I ever got humble, I'd be proud of it. And chastity, well, if we get a chance, we'll look at Franklin's sex life, but he led the league in mistresses and illegitimate children. His wife adopts 3 of them. They're more than probably, and the founding fathers weren't just called the founding fathers because they were men. They sired a lot of children. Of course, you have to remember the time, what marriages and stuff were about, and you saw it already in an old mistress's apologue. Those are the 2 hardest things. Well, why doesn't he put them first? Because will he achieve it right away? Will he have success with those things right away? No. Instead, he puts easy things in the beginning. And he gets some successes, and they convince him that the method will work. And then he moves on to the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. And every 13 weeks, he hits chastity and humility, and he has a bad week. But he's probably still a little more chaste than he would have been otherwise, and maybe a little bit more humble for that week. But if he had started out with those, he would have failed at them, he would have been depressed, he would have abandoned the method. And you notice he continues to, he improves on the method. He sets up a chart, one virtue at a time, Whenever he fails, he makes a little black mark. What was the problem? Too many black marks. When he'd go to the next week, he had to erase them all. He was tearing up the paper. So he stopped using paper. He uses horn, which is about the equivalent of plastic. And that way he could make the marks and they could wet them and rub them all off. So he improved on that method. When he wanted to get a social change made, he generally followed this method. He would write a letter anonymously to his newspaper and others, identifying the problem. Why anonymously? I don't know if Franklin's the one who said it, but nothing succeeds like success. One of the reasons Franklin could get so much stuff done is because he had gotten so much stuff done in the past. He hardly ever seemed to fail. You identify the problem anonymously because if other people write in and go, that's not a problem, what an idiot would think this was a problem. What does Ben do? He just pretends it wasn't him. Yeah, I don't know who wrote that in. That was really silly. Not a problem at all. If people write in and say it's a problem, he sends another letter anonymously proposing possible solutions. Why does he do that anonymously? Franklin talked about the Socratic method. He said initially he loved to argue. He just loved yelling at people and get excited, and he loved to win. And he'd win the argument, and every time they had a vote, he'd lose the vote. And finally, a minister of his said, that's because you're so arrogant, nobody can stand to admit that you were right. So they'll vote to their own detriment rather than have you have a victory. And he said, from then on, I never said this is how it is. I said, it seems to me, or better yet, I use Socratic method. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? What do you think of that? By a series of questions, he would lead you to the conclusion. Now, when you go to a public meeting and point out a problem, who gets put in charge of the committee to solve it? You do almost 100% of the time. Franklin wants change made. He doesn't want to spend all his time making the change. So Franklin, after writing anonymously, would go to somebody and say, what do you think about that street sweeping idea? Well, let me ask you this. You got a lot of dust around your place of business? Oh yeah, it gets on the clothes and stuff. I'm brushing them off all the time in order to sell them. You got dust at home? Yeah. What's your wife do about it? She sweeps it up. Sweeps it up. Yeah, sweeps it up. What do you think? You think streets could be swept? I suppose they... That's brilliant. You should go to the public meeting and say we should have the streets swept. And of course that guy goes, puts his hand up, we got a problem, I think streets could be swept. Who gets put in charge of organizing the street sweeping? The guy that Franklin sent there. Franklin, and of course after a while, Franklin knows he's going to get credit, because sooner or later somebody's going to say, that street sweeping thing, that was pretty smart. How'd you think of that? I was standing around talking to Franklin. Yeah, you know, it's amazing how many things get done here when somebody is standing around talking to Franklin. And if it fails, Franklin just walks away from it. He doesn't have to take any responsibility for it. Starts out with anonymous letters, never gets it until it's something credible. He never makes sure that it gets assigned to him. Now, when he's going to have the street, think of the street sweeping the streets in England. He thinks the stuff can be swept up. Okay, scientific method. You observe. You identify the problem. You make possible solutions. We can sweep it up. Then what do? What's the fourth step in the scientific method? You test it. So he says there's a little old lady sweeping 1 square yard in front of his house and hoping to get a handout. He employs her to sweep the street. He gives her a shilling. She comes back way before he expected her to. Does he take her word for it that she's done? No, a rationalist has to have evidence. He sends his servant. The servant comes back and says, it's done perfectly. Does Franklin hire her then to sweep the streets? What does he do? He hires a young man. He says, if an old lady can do it in this amount of time, a young man can do it in half. Now, a romantic would say, what a despicable thing you did. This lady worked hard and you didn't reward her. This lady was sick and coughing. She needed the money. She didn't get it. She did a good job. You didn't give her the job sweeping the streets. You used her. What would Franklin say? I I didn't promise her a career in street sweeping. Look, everybody came out ahead here. I gave her more money to sweep the street than she could possibly have earned begging. So she came out ahead. I never promised her any more than that. I promised her a shilling, she swept the street, she did it, I gave her the shilling. I didn't cheat her. The job was never hers. The job could never have been hers. In order to get the street sweeping done, it's going to be by subscription. Everybody's going to have to contribute. If I hire an army of old ladies, I'm going to have to charge this much. People probably won't sign up for that. If I hire a bunch of young men, they will sign up for it. Let me finish this last point and then we'll go. So it won't even be done if it's done by old ladies. Plus, if we got to employ somebody, why is it better to employ young men than it is to employ old women? Why is it better for society?
Keep them occupied.
Keeps them occupied. If you have young men out of work, they probably have families. What will they do if they can't find work? Steal. They'll turn to armed robbery. Very few little old ladies are going to turn to armed robbery. And you'll catch them anyway because they're slow. Children, families, the man all profit. The little old lady can still make money begging. The young man can't. Everybody comes out ahead. Okay, next week we'll look at more Franklin and his rationalism.